just want to welcome you to St. Francis's College's Yom HaShoah commemoration. This started about 20 years ago by a former president, Dr. Frank Macchiarola, and it's been a very important part of the end of the year events that occur at the college. We have been blessed by having a number of different types of events in the past, whether it's been from the arts or discussion or from music. And this year, it's going to be an interesting speaker as well. I would like to just say a few words. My name is Dr. Alan Brewski. I'm a professor of biology. I'm the Dean of Sciences and Health Sciences. And I am a second-generation survivor of parents who survived the Holocaust. Sometimes I think we're a little distant. We think of the Holocaust as a historical event. For the survivors of the Holocaust, it's a real life situation, an emotional situation. For second-generation survivors, that's what we call ourselves, it is also a very real event. But I sometimes think that we forget what we're really commemorating. So just to put this into some perspective, and that is the Holocaust was a result of policies created by a German Chancellor at that time called Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, and it was essentially a means, I would simply say, of taking over the world, but to get rid of people in their country who were not considered to be pure German. These included Jews, Roma Gypsies, people with mental and physical disabilities, political prisoners, blacks, and others. But the main targets of the Holocaust were the Jewish people, up to 6 million living in Europe at that time. Millions of the Jewish people were subjugated under the Nazi Party, facing social and political discrimination, at least that's how it started, forced to live in ghettos, as my parents were, segregated from others, and systematically removed from their homes to concentration camps in the final solution policy that began in 1941. It's really estimated that over 10 million people lost their lives in the years of the Holocaust. So again, I am the son of immigrants to the United States. I am the son of Holocaust survivors. I am the son of parents who lived in refugee camps, which they kindly called DP camps after the war for a number of years. I am the son of people who survived hatred. I am the son of survivors that had no place to go in the world and no one wanted to take them. I consider myself extraordinarily lucky. I'm the son of parents who did wander around Europe, unable to go to their homes for the most part. It is partly of who I am, my family, it is my identity. However, I sometimes say that the greatest revenge that I have were my children and my siblings, and that's really for those who are interested, there are 3 lawyers, 2 professors, and 5 doctors. I think it's an incredible statement that out of these ashes came people who save lives, who do research, and get innocent people out of jail. That's for the lawyer part of my family. Although my family is split, my sister has the lawyers, my side of the family has the doctors. What can I tell you? But I am really haunted by ghosts of the past. There have been many volumes written about the Holocaust. Psychologists and sociologists, historians write these books. But sometimes the history or what they write about is really just historical events. And what has happened in the passing years, as the survivors die, memories sometimes disappear. So we really lose the concept of what has happened. That's what history does when we lose that personal touch. It is a very emotional thing for me, but for us to understand the Holocaust was born of hate. It was a historical hate in some regards. They rose to the surface because hate was accepted. As I get older and see the survivors disappear, it's probably more important for you people to hear the story, for you people to hear the memories firsthand. That is what makes memories in history, and that, in this case, to see the disease of anti-Semitism, which is rising throughout the United States, on college campuses and throughout the world, including hatred of people who are different and foreign. This is something that I'm not sure that we've learned from history, but I hope we do. But there are different types of issues that have to be dealt with. One, people like myself and many of you, is how do we relate to God after all these atrocities? What happens to our faith? Number two is how do we define ourselves individually or as a group, and how to relate to people who don't understand or have not suffered? Three, scientists, you have to forgive me thinking threes and fours, so we'll go from there. What is the legacy of memory, and how do we transfer that memory to others, future generations, lest we forget? And a phrase comes to mind, a Hebrew term called tikkun olam. And that's what very simply says this: what are we doing to change the works in the world for better? What should we be doing to prevent future persecutions and genocides, discrimination, injustice? And how will you today integrate with what you hear from our guest speaker? From the Kaddish, which I am not going to recite, the closing lines of the Jewish prayer for the dead is very simple. It says this: may there be abundant peace from heaven and life for us and for all Israel, and say Amen. He who creates peace in the celestial heights, may he create peace for us and for all Israel, and say Amen. Today's speaker, I'm really proud to introduce, is Sonja Maier Geismar. She was born in Germany. She was on a ship called the St. Louis. She was 4 years old at the time. I can't imagine, though, you look much younger than from what I calculate. She worked as a librarian. She works as an adjunct librarian for another college, which I will not mention. But she was on that ill-fated ship called the St. Louis. That was a ship that they put refugees on and could just wander throughout the Atlantic and through the Caribbean, and no country, the United States and Cuba, would accept these people. And ultimately, they went back to where they came from. Many of the survivors were murdered in the camps. There were a few survivors, and I'm glad to say our speaker was able to survive, make it to the United States, and create a life with 2 wonderful children, lots of grandchildren. So I would like to welcome Sonja Maier Geismar to St. Francis College.
Good afternoon, faculty members, staff, students, and community guests. Thank you, Ms. Spinelli, for inviting me to St. Francis College's commemoration of Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah. Can you hear me? No? Yes. Okay. A little loud. Okay. And thank you, Professor, for a lovely introduction. Hitler became Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, and wasted no time in implementing his anti-Jewish policy. In less than 3 months, an economic boycott of Jewish-owned businesses and offices of professionals was staged. A whirlwind of over 400 anti-Jewish laws over the next 6 years were enacted by the federal and state governments. These legal methods of persecution and exclusion impacted all aspects of the public and private lives of the 500,000 Jews who comprised less than 1% of Germany's population of 67 million. The laws included, but were not these are just some of the laws. Removal of Jews from civil service, revocation of citizenship of Jewish naturalized citizens, no admission to legal professions, removal of Jewish teachers and students from public schools and universities. Jewish physicians could treat only Jewish patients. Disclosure of assets and regulation of transfers of assets to non-Jews. Passports required the letter J on the cover and the insertion of the middle names of Israel for men and Sarah for women. The closure of Jewish-owned businesses. Revocation of citizenship and prohibition from marrying the pure race, the Germans. The Nazi swastika flag became the national flag. And of course, the Nuremberg race laws that defined Jews by lineage rather than by religious beliefs. In addition to these restrictions, there were supposedly spontaneous book burnings, shattering of shop windows, and the presence of menacing, growling dogs to instill fear and intimidation. Political opponents, homosexuals, and Jehovah's Witnesses were also targeted as dangerous. The Nazi propaganda campaign demonized all these undesirables and created a climate of indifference and lack of concern so that people were intimidated and reluctant to oppose Hitler. Many intellectuals, scientists, professors, authors, musicians, movie producers, and cinematographers emigrated once they were forbidden to practice their professions. The brain drain created a loss of human capital for Germany, but was a gain for the United States. Most Jews adjusted to the restrictions and dealt with fear and indignities in their daily lives. They believed that the regime was a temporary aberration and would soon collapse. As Professor Peter Gay stated, "We were the Germans. The gangsters who had taken control of the country were not Germany, we were." Do you leave or do you stay? And if you stay, at what point do you leave? And where would you go? At the Avion Conference in 1938, during the summer of 1938, only the Dominican Republic and Bolivia were willing to accept refugees. The Nazis used this dismal outcome of this international meeting of 32 countries to justify their policies. Hitler was further emboldened. No one else wanted the Jews, so he can do what he wants. Kristallnacht made it crystal clear that life in Germany was no longer tolerable. A new era began on November 9th to 10th, 1938. My family, along with about 100 other Jewish families, lived in Malch, a small town in Baden in southwest Germany. Jews and their Christian neighbors got along well. For that reason, the Gestapo that came to our town were from other towns. I was only 4 years old, but I will never forget Kristallnacht. I remember Nazis barging into our house, throwing the contents of the bureau drawers to the floor, breaking crystal and dishes, and ripping open the light green quilts in my parents' bedroom, scattering down feather around the room. It's been documented that ruining the quilts was routine throughout the country, and of course, all of us have seen Fiddler on the Roof. So when the Russians come in and destroy the quilts. My most terrifying moment was seeing a photo of my father torn into many pieces. As my mother held me in her arms, I cried bitterly as I thought that meant he had died. Earlier in the day, my father, along with other men, was incarcerated in Dachau, where he was beaten, starved, and mistreated for 5 weeks. A similar scenario was repeated throughout the country. My father was released on condition that he leave Germany. What was the world's reaction to Kristallnacht? The news was carried on radio, clergymen decried from pulpits, newspaper editorials were critical, rallies were held, sympathy was expressed, but there was no action. The purpose of Kristallnacht was to accelerate the expulsion of Jews from Germany. About 120,000 left Germany during the winter of 1938-9, almost as many as had emigrated the previous 5 years. Strict regulations were imposed on wealth that could be taken out of Germany, rendering refugees virtually penniless. Passports with the letter J on the cover, men were given the middle name of Isaac, and women the name of Sarah. There would be no mistaking their identity. The other half of the equation of emigration was the receiving country. Which countries would accept refugees? Same problem we're having now. Many fled to the neighboring countries west of Germany, but there was a limit to how many they would accept. Others found their way to Central and South America as well as to Africa. But the favorite destination was the USA, which had a quota system. The limit for Greater Germany, which now included Austria, was 27,370 individuals per year. That quota was used up by May 1939. What prevented refugees from entering the United States? Isolationism, a depressed economy, unemployment, a fear of having to provide more people on public assistance, and the refusal to modify immigration procedures. All these factors, plus anti-Semitism, limited entry to the United States. Even the Wagner-Rogers bill to admit 20,000 refugee children outside the quota system was defeated. The Undersecretary of State in charge of visas instructed his consuls and diplomats to create paper walls, use delaying tactics and impediments to delay issuance of documents to enter the U.S. Where could Jews go? Where would my family find a safe haven until our quota numbers would be called? One of our relatives shared information that Cuba was selling landing permits for $150 per person, and there was passage on the St. Louis. On May 13, 1939, 6 months after Kristallnacht, we boarded the St. Louis to escape living under Hitler and the Nazis. My parents had decided that I would not be part of the 10,000 kinder transport to England. We traveled with my parents, paternal grandparents, and 2 great aunts, a group of 7 mayors, my family name. The Lobes, my grandfather's sister's family, traveled as a group of 9. 7 members of that family were already in Cuba. The St. Louis was a luxurious cruise ship. Its brochure read, "It's a ship on which one travels securely and lives in comfort. There is everything one can wish for that makes life on board a pleasure." I remember its gleaming floors, wide staircases, crystal chandeliers, and a large dining room. For the first time, I tasted ananas, pineapple. I saw the ship's dark-skinned personnel for the first time. My mother told me they were good people. They were not Hitlers. Despite the relief of leaving Europe, there was anxiety among the passengers about starting life in a new country, and sadness and concern about leaving loved ones behind. My maternal grandparents were still in Germany and struggled to emigrate, but were sent to the Gurs internment camp in southern France and eventually were murdered in Auschwitz. The ship's bells woke us up early on May 27th after 2 weeks at sea. We were ready to disembark to our temporary safe haven, but our tourist landing permits had been declared invalid. Why? These are the landing permits of my grandparents, all right? They're very official. The Immigration Department of Cuba, etc., okay? This is my parents and a great aunt on the gangplank going onto the ship. And this is the St. Louis. Now, why were they declared illegal? In early 1939, Cuban law distinguished between immigrants who required a visa and a $500 bond, and tourists who could enter without visas. So the Immigration Secretary, Benitez, issued and sold landing permits to refugees who could enter as tourists and stay only until the visas to other countries could be obtained. And most of the passengers did have, over 700 passengers had visas to the United States. But a new law was issued on May 5th, 1 week before the St. Louis left Hamburg. Decree 937, equal to the number of passengers on the ship, required written authorization from Cuban secretaries of Labor and State, plus a $500 bond for each person. This closed the loophole and eliminated the tourist status. Why was the law passed? The Immigration Secretary enriched himself by selling the landing permits and would not share his profits with the other secretaries. It's estimated that he pocketed $500,000 through these landing permits. Also, economic conditions in Cuba were not good. A few thousand refugees had already reached Cuba, and Goebbels, Germany's propaganda minister, sent 14 agents to stir up anti-Semitism. In his daily news report, Goebbels referred to the St. Louis passengers as Untermenschen, subhuman, criminals, disabled, etc., compared to the Aryan Übermenschen. Reading this, the ship's captain snapped, "I'll get these people ashore in Havana even if the whole propaganda ministry tries to stop me." I remember standing on the deck waving to people in tenders and fishing boats below. And there they are. Relatives and other people would come out and wave and talk to their relatives on the ship. We waved to the Lobes, who were already in Cuba and who were anxious to reunite with their families on the ship. They were not reunited at that time. What would happen to us? Where could we go? Which country would accept us? Those worrisome days of uncertainty and desperation weighed heavily on the adults and older children, but I was shielded and unaware. After negotiations between the Joint, the Jewish Distribution Committee, which is still in existence, the negotiations with JDC and the Cuban officials failed. The ship was ordered out of Cuban waters. I have to say now that there were passengers on the ship, about between 20 and 30, who were able to disembark because they had relatives or friends in Cuba, knew about the change in the law, and were able to raise $500 per person bond. But remember, people were forced to leave Germany without any wealth, without any money. So it was impossible for the others to raise that kind of money. Had the ship had a different captain, who knows what would have happened? Hoping that entry into the United States would be permitted, Captain Gustav Schroeder sailed to the coast of Florida. Throughout the voyage, the captain's staunch anti-Nazi position was made clear by his actions, instructing the crew on proper behavior toward passengers, removing Hitler's photograph from the social hall for religious services, appealing to Canada for entry, and promising and reassuring passengers that he would not return them to Germany. He considered running the ship aground so that England would be forced to rescue us. Our escape to freedom had become a voyage doomed, damned, double-crossed. These are all titles of documentaries about the voyage. To gain time, the captain took a slow and circuitous route back to Europe. Fearing the worst, he created a suicide watch committee because of the desperation and anguish felt by the passengers. My father joined the committee, and Captain Schroeder was thoughtful enough to write letters of gratitude to its members. The letter, which was treasured by my parents, is now displayed in my home. Captain Schroeder was honored posthumously by Yad Vashem as a righteous Gentile. As one historian wrote, the St. Louis remains a vivid reminder of the dangers of nationalistic immigration, but also of the hope inspired by the deeds of a single person. Okay, so this is a photo of people on the ship, and I'm the little girl on the bottom left, and this is me. But here is Captain Schroeder. And here is a copy of the letter that he wrote. For that matter, I only found the letter after my mother passed away in 2003. She didn't remember where she had put it, and she put it in a box along with all the sympathy cards she received when my father passed away very young. And when I saw the letter, I froze. I could not believe that finally we had this letter. And here is the translation. All right? And the important part is that the people were nervous. Captain Schroeder was concerned about nervous breakdowns during the passengers' critical time of desperation and hopelessness. So, the ship had to go back to Europe, all right? He promised that he would not bring us back to Germany. But where could he go? Through the joint negotiations headed by the European representative of the joint, by the name of Morris Troper, Great Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands agreed to accept the passengers. When the St. Louis, no one went back to Germany, okay? When the St. Louis docked in Antwerp, my relatives, the Loebs, disembarked. The younger members of the family arrived in the United States in May 1940. The elder Loebs were eventually sent to Auschwitz. A freighter, the Rocadis, took the rest of the passengers from Antwerp to the other countries. The freighter was obviously in sharp contrast to the St. Louis, We slept on double-decker cots, dormitory style. Men and women were separated. There were no activities, and what my mother told me, I did not like the food. How was my family fortunate enough to go to England rather than to the continent? Passengers were given a preference, and my parents correctly surmised that the waters between England and Germany would be protective. Also, if you had relatives or friends in the receiving country, you were a preferred immigrant to that country. And it was clear that people could stay only until their visas would, their quota numbers would be called. We lived in Broadhurst Gardens in London in a boarding house run by Mrs. Lee, a Quaker. She taught me my first nursery rhyme in English, Baba Black Sheep, and I always included her in the song. In order to cover some of the expenses of living there, my mother became the cook for the house. World War II started only 3 months after the passengers were dispersed to their respective countries. The threat of the Nazis followed all of us. After 7 months in England, our quota numbers were called, and we arrived in New York City on February 11th, 1940. We awoke early to glimpse the Statue of Liberty as we entered New York Harbor. It is a sight I will never forget. We moved to the Bronx, where we lodged with a relative, but had our meals with our aunt. With the help of Hayas, which is still in existence today, of course, my family soon rented our own apartment. My mother, who had household help in Germany, became a domestic worker for a short time until her English improved and was able to take an office job. My father, who owned his own business in Europe, his first job here was as a night watchman, and he was fired because he fell asleep. And then he became a Fuller Brush salesman. People here probably remember Fuller Brush, okay? The younger people probably don't. But they went from house to house selling household cleaning products, etc. And it was a very common job for people who had just come to the country. After that, he started his own business as a personal shopper. He passed away in 1953, and my mother continued his business. She was devoted to her family and had strength of character and determination. She was the elegant matriarch of our family and lived to see 5 of her 9 great-grandchildren. She was interviewed for the Steven Spielberg Oral History Project. She passed away at the age of 93. My husband Arnold, who was also a refugee, and I are blessed with a wonderful family. Our daughter has 3 children, and the family has made its home in Israel. My son and wife and 2 children live in New York City. I owe my good fortune not only to my parents, but also to the JDC that negotiated the agreement for the passengers, and to Hayas that assisted us and other refugees, as it still does today. The Nazi progression of marginalization, expulsion, containment, and elimination came to its devastating end in 1945. Amid these tragic events, there were many courageous, moral individuals, unsung heroes, who risked their lives to shelter Jews. There were also diplomats from China, Japan, Sweden, and El Salvador who issued visas to escape from Europe. And there were others who urged changes in our government's policy. For instance, Jan Karski, a Catholic who joined the Polish underground movement as a courier, entered the Warsaw Ghetto and the Belzec killing camp and reported his findings to the Polish government in exile, the British Foreign Minister Anthony Eden, FDR, and many others. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter's response was, "I'm not calling you a liar, but I don't believe you." The Allies knew about this systematic annihilation by December 1942. How One Man Tried to Stop the Holocaust is a must-read about Karski. Another person was James Mcdonald. He tried to aid European Jewish refugees throughout the Nazi era and was a critic of our refugee policy. He served as League of Nations High Commissioner from 1933 to 35, attended the Evian Conference, the failed conference, and chaired FDR's Advisory Committee on Political Refugees from 1938 to 1945. He called for the opening of Palestine as a refuge and discounted Arab opposition as appeasement. He described the Allied response to the Holocaust as pitifully insufficient, indifferent, and calamitous blindness. The third person was Josiah Du Bois, who was an aide in our Treasury Department and risked his career in exposing the actions of the State Department. He discovered that the State Department blocked the transfer of funds to rescue refugees, and these were for Hungary, as well as the department suppressed information. He named Breckinridge Long, the head of the visa division, whose paper walls, postponements, and obstructions prevented thousands from entering the United States, and that included my grandparents. Du Bois' report, titled with very strong language, it was "The Acquiescence of This Government in the Murder of the Jews," was passed to FDR, who subsequently established the War Refugee Board in 1944, and it saved about 200,000 lives. Blowing the Whistle on Genocide by Raphael Medoff follows Du Bois' story. It's a short book, and it will really have an impact on you. Now, what happened to the passengers? 288 were assigned to Great Britain, 224 to France, 214 to Belgium, 182 to the Netherlands. No one was returned to Germany. World War II began just 3 months after reaching these nations, and now everyone was in danger, including people in Great Britain, because once the Blitz started, it was really, would Britain survive this onslaught? In no time, Hitler swept over Western Europe. About half of the passengers on the continent survived by emigrating, going into hiding, or being protected as children living in convents. The amazing stories of some of these survivors are featured in a book entitled Refugees Denied. It took the authors, who are at the United States Holocaust Museum and Memorial, it took them 10 years to trace every passenger or their descendants. It was an incredible undertaking, and it's a very readable book. 254, unfortunately, were murdered in death camps. Today, we honor and remember them and the 6 million on Yom HaShoah. Through the efforts of one of the passengers, contacts were maintained and reunions held. I never went to any of them until December 2009, and I opened this envelope. I couldn't imagine what was in this huge envelope, and this is the cover. So you see the ship in the hand and a Jewish star. And this is what the invitation looked like. In December 2009, my sister and I attended an unforgettable 4-day reunion in Florida with 33 other passengers and their guests to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the voyage. The children and young adult passengers on the St. Louis grew up to be resilient and productive. Many made significant contributions in medicine, science, law, and education. For instance, Arno Mitulski, who died recently, was one of the founders of pharmacogenetics and earned worldwide recognition. Clark Blateis was a thermal physiologist and professor emeritus. Saul Messenger is a pathologist and professor of medicine, and he gives talks about the St. Louis all the time. Thomas Jacobson has dedicated his legal career to fighting injustice and successfully argued a case before the Supreme Court. Herbert Carlina has been the spokesman for the passengers and was involved in the USHMM's exhibit of the St. Louis. Professor Ruth Mandel was appointed to the governing board of the USHMM. Retired Colonel Philip Freund, one of the passengers, spearheaded an initiative for a Senate resolution which recognized our country's role in forcing the ship back to Europe. And here is the resolution. And the last sentence is important. The resolution states the need for public officials and educators to raise awareness of the relevance of the ship to current and future generations. Copies of the Senate resolution were signed by each passenger and presented to the dignitaries and representatives of many organizations such as the JDC, the National Archives, USHMM. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of people there. The reunion was sponsored by the generosity of a Florida businessman who founded the National Foundation for Jewish Continuity. The foundation also created the St. Louis Legacy Project, whose mission is to promote awareness of issues of human rights, immigration, and refugee policy, all current issues we are dealing with, or in many situations, not dealing with today. In 2012, the State Department and the Legacy Project co-sponsored a special tribute at which a proclamation of gratitude was presented to the ambassadors of the 4 countries to acknowledge their admission of the passengers. Okay, so this is a group photo of, right here in the right-hand corner, no, that wouldn't be, former Secretary Eisenstadt, and he's now head of the claims conference, was one of the guest speakers. And Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State, was supposed to be there, but Benghazi interfered. Okay? The Legacy Project also supports the showing of its film Complicit, which deals with the U.S. foreign policy, FDR, and the St. Louis. The film has been shown to community groups, religious groups, colleges, universities, and at an international conference on refugees. The St. Louis symbolizes the world's indifference to refugees in crisis. The last photo here, okay, the Legacy Project was invited to the Truman Institute of Hebrew University in Jerusalem. It was a 2-day conference. And we also went to the Garden of the Righteous to visit the name of Captain Schroeder. And here we are at the wall, and some of these people were not on the ship. There were 5 of us who were passengers. The others are guests and whatnot. But that is it. I close with the words of Pastor Martin Niemöller, a foe of Hitler who spent the last 7 years of Nazi rule in concentration camps. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Thank you for your attention, and I'm open to your questions.
Very, very moving. Before we open for general questions, I would like to present 2 of our students, Donna Maria Shapiro, who we can give them a chance to ask you some questions. But
Very
again, I will say one thing. Like a true librarian, we do appreciate the books that you gave us to read.
I have to do it. I can't not do it. But they are really very worthwhile, particularly because it gives you a glimpse of how people, there are about 10 people featured in the book, plus the introduction, which has a history of the voyage, etc. And all the stories, of course, are varied, and it gives you an idea of the perseverance and the desire to survive, and really some incredible stories.
Hi. Was your family religious growing up?
Oh, yes, yes. We were what you would call Orthodox, and we continued that when we came here. And now I consider myself conservative, even though I belong to an Orthodox synagogue.
Have you ever considered making Aliyah?
No.
No?
No. My daughter and her husband, both, her husband was born here as well. They just had this commitment, this emotional commitment, and to Israel. They both went to Tel Yehuda, and no, I'm trying to think of the organization that heads it. I can't remember for the moment. But they are there. They've been there for over 23 years. They come every summer.
What can we do to help bring awareness to anti-Semitism?
Say that again?
What can we do to help bring awareness to anti-Semitism?
The first thing that can be done is to make people aware that it exists and call out. And sometimes it's maybe hard to distinguish. And then to prove that Holocaust denial is an absolute hoax, and to keep on talking and being active in Jewish organizations and supporting them.
The world is filled with refugees today from many countries and different religions and different ethnic groups. Do you have any comments on United States immigration policy now?
Very good question. During the Holocaust, there was opposition to admitting Jews because it was felt that there might be spies among them, which was obviously rather ludicrous. Today, we are not, the United States is not doing its share. If you have an 18-month vetting process, and I am certain that through good questioning, etc., you can weed out anyone who would be a danger to our country. And it's not just our country. The doors have been closed. The situation is so similar in that there are so many refugees and very few countries really want to accept them. It's a terrible situation.
I read very briefly something on the internet yesterday. I don't remember the name of the Holocaust survivor who made this comment, but it was a Holocaust survivor who made the comment saying he might have been older than you when he was growing up in Germany, but he said he was very afraid by current events because it reminded him of the atmosphere in Germany during the early days of when Hitler came to power, because people don't realize that Hitler was elected in the first place. And I thought I'd like you to comment on that, even though you were 4 when you left Germany.
Well, I don't have, my recollections of my life in Germany are very, very limited. And unfortunately, really unfortunately, I never questioned my parents about what restrictions affected them the most. And that's lost. That whole generation is gone, and I will never find out what they endured on a personal level. But the world is not pleasant today. It's not a good situation. After my mother passed away, my sister and I donated a lot of our photos, documents, etc. No diaries, didn't keep that, and to the USHMM, yes. Well, the Center for Jewish History is, in case some of you don't know, it's one building that houses 4 or 5 different organizations. And one of them is the Leo Baeck Institute, which concentrates on German-speaking Jewry. And right now they have an exhibit, and actually you can see it online. Every day they are featuring a different document that was used in Germany to... like the one I had, it said boycott. Boycott in very bold letters. So you can go on to lbi.org and see what they have.
Yeah, as a child, going through all of this in Europe, the traveling and then going on the ship and all, do you remember how you felt? Were you nervous? Were you sick? Were you anxious? Do you remember any of your feelings?
I don't know.
No.
I don't know. All I know is there's a photo of me, maybe I was 6 years old, and what a sad expression I had on my face. But I can't tell you my feelings. After my second year of working, a friend and I took a European tour, and I had to go back to my hometown. It just to see if what I remembered is the way it really looked. So we went into Germany and in one day out. It was just for that. I could not stay in Germany any longer. However, and I've no contact really with that town. My mother's hometown was more vibrant. And they have done an incredible job on trying to reunite Jews and non-Jews. The synagogue, which I have a picture of, was restored after it had been used as a warehouse for hay or some such thing. It was restored, and it is now the center for meetings of, there's an organization that has meetings there to bridge the gap, okay? It also had a newsletter which has been discontinued, but there is a man there whom I'm in correspondence with. I've never met him. He does not speak English, so it's very hard communicating, and my German is virtually non-existent. And he takes care of the cemetery and informs me of many other things. However, I do have I don't know if he's a relative or a family friend who grew up in the town. He and another woman go back there all the time to speak. And they write. So that's important. And someday, maybe, I would like to take my children and grandchildren to my mother's hometown. For that matter, that book, that town is being featured in a book that is being written currently. It's not due, probably next year it'll be published.
What's the name of the town?
Kippenheim, the center of the world. And we've had 2 reunions of our family. The last one was in 2005. We had over 160 people from here, from Israel, England, Australia, God knows where. And we are organizing another reunion for this summer, but it will not be as many people. In Pennsylvania. Right. No, Kippenheim is the center.
I would like to thank you for
Oh.
honoring us with your presence today.
Thank you.
And, yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. I guess I should include that. He was sent to New York City. The ship arrived in New York on August 26th, 1939, for a cruise to the Caribbean. He was told not to have anyone embark the ship. He was told to leave U.S. waters. And of course, a few days later, a short time later, the war broke out. The ship went to Murmansk, Russia, where it was waylaid for 4 months. Most of the crew went back to Germany or wherever they came from, but the engineer stayed there, and then he eventually got back to Germany. He was instructed not to discuss the events with either privately or publicly, and he tried to write a book. He wasn't too successful. He took a desk job. He was in one of the trials after the war, and the people who were very active on the synagogue, Lisa Loeb's parents, they testified on his behalf. They sent food, clothes, whatever they could throughout, and supported him, and he passed away. Unfortunately, he passed away before he was honored by Yad Vashem. He was a short man. He was very athletic in terms of exercising, and he was an incredible person.
Thank you.
And the ship itself?
I'm sorry?
And the ship itself, what happened to the ship?
Oh, the ship was bombed, and it was repaired. Then it became a floating hotel, and then it was dismantled sometime in the 50s. And sold for scrap.
Again, thank you very much. If you have more questions,